Hello, everyone. I'm Naomi Foyle, reader in critical imaginative writing here at the University of Chichester, creative writing editor of Grammary, the journal of the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fiction, and along with my colleagues at the centre, Heather Robbins, Dr. Lorenzo Gianfrancesco, and Dr. Paul Quinn, one of your hosts today. So whether you are with us here in the suitably modern Gothic cloisters, festooned today with phantasmagorical feminist art, or joining us online from around the world, welcome to Angela Carter, A Radical Prescience, a symposium held in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the death of one of Britain's most important and frankly magnificent writers. We're sure Angela Carter, as a paid-up sci-fi sibyl, would have been tickled by this hybrid event, and also that she would have appreciated the still slightly surreal sight of a room full of masked literati. It is the university policy to encourage mask wearing, and given that we will be in the room all day, I thank you for your cooperation and consideration while milling around. Having said that, live speakers and storytellers may wish to remove their masks, and in general, to do or not to do is ultimately your personal choice. If you're vulnerable, though, and you really want everyone to wear their masks, please just quietly talk to Heather or I, and I will ask everyone to kindly comply. If you'd like to tweet during the event, please do. We're using the hashtag CHI, C-H-I, Carter, or one word, capital C, capital C. The fire exits are to the front and the back, but we think the best one is the front here. The loos are in the entrance hall. With that, I believe my housekeeping fairy duties are done, and I can introduce both the event and our first keynote speaker. We know that some people attending today or watching later will have known Angela well, and we hope the event pays fizzing tribute to the woman you loved. Please, though, everyone, note the question mark in the title. In the sprightly spirit of the writer herself, today's discussion of Carter's tremendous legacy is dedicated to the processes of puzzling out and probing, quizzical inquiry, and generous interrogation. The title stems from our conviction that Carter, with her spectacularly forensic interests in gender, sexuality, racialization, colonialism, war, animality, and power, prognosticated and in many cases precociously relished the huge cultural and political shifts in our understandings of ourselves and each other we are experiencing today as members of a digitally interconnected, globalized world. But that is not to say that Carter is beyond critique. As our first keynote speaker, Natsumi Ikoma, has explored, Carter targeted her own identity and practice, and thus perhaps she can be seen as an early adopter of the idea of questioning your privilege. I must pause here and say that in planning this symposium, I did not anticipate Carter's reflections on the threat of nuclear war to prove to be quite so prescient. But I will say more on that along with my thank yous in my closing remarks. Time is of the essence, and we want to hear from the many fabulous speakers lined up today like scintillating fireworks. So please let me turn to the pleasurable task of introducing Natsumi Ikoma, opening the symposium with her keynote speech, Angela Carter as a Global Literature Author. Natsumi Ikoma is a professor of literature and gender and sexuality studies at International Christian University, Japan. Her interests include monstrosity, the post-human, Orientalism, and performativity. Her publications include the essays Encounter with the Mirror of the Other, Angela Carter and Her Personal Connection with Japan, in Women Writing Across Cultures, Present, Past, Future, published by Routledge in 2017. Monstrous Marionette, The Tale of a Japanese Doll by Angela Carter, in Reorienting the Fairy Tale, Contemporary Adaptations Across Cultures, published by Wayne State University Press in 2020, and Discussing Carter in Relation to Japanese Puppetry, Tattoo Art, and Masculinity, Carter and Japanese Signs, Bunraku, Mishima, Irezumi, and Sozo Araki, in Angela Carter's Pyrotechnics, A Union of Contraries, published by Bloomsbury in 2022, edited by Marie Mulvey Roberts and Charlotte Crofts, who it's our pleasure to have here today as well. As she explains in that chapter, Natsumi is also the instigator and translator of Seduced by Japan, a memoir of the days spent with Angela Carter by Sozo Araki, Carter's lover in Japan, whom Natsumi convinced to write about his past. Currently, Natsumi is an associate editor for the forthcoming special issue of Contemporary Women's Writing on Carter. I am thrilled to welcome her to open our symposium.
Thank you, Naomi. Let me share my screen. I hope it works. Okay, how about this? Can you see it? Okay. All right. Can you see my first slide?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, everyone, good morning, or for those of you who are in a different time zone like myself, good evening or good afternoon. My name is Natsumi Ikoma. I am an Angela Carter scholar from Japan. As those of us gathered here are all aware, this year is the 30th anniversary of Angela Carter's premature death. It is a great honor and slightly daunting as well to be able to give a keynote lecture in a conference that marks this special year for Angela Carter studies to fellow scholars from all over the world. I would like to give special thanks to the organizers of the event, Dr. Naomi Foyle, Heather Robbins, and all the staff at the Chichester Center for Fairy Tale, Fantasy, and Speculative Fiction for organizing such a wonderful event in this difficult time under the influence of the pandemic. Also, my heart goes out to those impacted by the current invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops. My heart goes out to those who have had to flee from their homeland, who have had to fight for their survival, who have family and friends in Ukraine. I'm horrified that such a blatant colonial desire has been exercised, and I strongly condemn it. I'm sure Angela Carter, if she were here, would have done the same. This atrocity is affecting not only Ukraine, but all of Europe and beyond, showing us how the world is connected in this globalized world. I pray for no more loss of lives and the swift return of peace. In such a global climate of uncertainty, we must acknowledge the merits that online or hybrid conferences offers us, such as easier access and a much wider audience, although ideally miss face-to-face interactions at non-virtual conferences. The elimination of financial barriers involving travel costs, especially of international travel, means that scholars with limited financial means can now attend conferences more easily than before. Considering the job market in academia all over the world, where more and more tenured positions are being replaced by contractual positions, where academic posts are becoming less stable than ever before, this is a significant change. Before, participation in a conference was a privilege only tenable to a few lucky ones, but this is less the case now. Online participation is also beneficial to those with disabilities or health issues that would have prevented them from attending face-to-face conferences. By being able to go online without leaving the comfort of their homes, they can interact with people in different households, different districts, different countries, even on different continents. Online conferences are also convenient for those with multiple jobs and responsibilities, those who cannot afford to dedicate several days to a conference, those with responsibilities for caring for young children, sick or elderly family members, partners, or pets. With modern technology and thanks to COVID-19, though it's rare that I ever feel gratitude towards the pandemic, online meetings and conferences are our new normal. I'm sure there are a number of scholars here who could not have participated in this wonderful conference if it were only offered face to face. Taking into account the fact that the majority of caring responsibilities are shouldered by women, and the fact that low-income jobs, including contractual positions in academia, are also unequally distributed to women, the benefit of online meetings is a feminist intervention to inequality. I'm quite sure Angela Carter would have been pleased with the egalitarian effect they bring to the study and celebration of her own works. Let me begin today's lecture with the statement that Angela Carter is truly an author of global literature. This might sound too obvious. Her oeuvre has been studied all over the world and translated into many languages. Since her premature death in 1992, Angela Carter's reputation has only grown. Her readership is spreading across the globe. The fact that I am speaking to you today is evidence of her global presence. One of the reasons for her global popularity is her multiplicity and hybridity. It is not possible to categorize her literature into one genre. She's a novelist, a fairy tale writer, a translator, poet, a magic realist, a surrealist, a journalist. One cannot pin her literature down to one nationality either. Although her literature was obviously influenced by the English literary heritage, she was often vocally critical about the colonialist, nationalist, and sexist nature of English high literature, and mocked the Shakespearean actors' invasion of English America in her last novel, Wise Children. She was critical about the colonial history of Great Britain and was also critical about the cultural imperialism of English literature, while at the same time she was painfully aware she was part of it. Carter made it plain that her work had also been influenced by many other cultures, including French, Spanish, Italian, German, Eastern European, Russian, American, and Japanese, to name but a few. She reviewed many non-English writers in her journalism and introduced many stories from non-European cultures in her fairy tale collections. She questioned the demarcation of national literature, it seems. In fact, she presented herself as Scottish while she was in Japan, which may have been an attempt at distancing herself from Englishness and its colonial history and the idea of racial supremacy. She celebrated hybridity and flinched at the idea of purity. She was not particularly interested in maintaining past legacies. As she writes, I am all for putting new wine in old bottles, especially if the pressure of the new wine makes the old bottles explode, quote and unquote. Now, in the 21st century, the world is catching up with Angela Carter, and we are witnessing the global social justice movement against retaining legacies of colonial past, slave trade, and racism. Carter's progressiveness as an author of global literature is also seen in her feminism. Her feminism was non-sectarian, not biologically defined. It was definitely not about victimhood of women. In The Passion of New Eve, which was published in 1977, it features trans characters. Carter explored the idea of gender performativity and demonstrated how gender oppression works both ways, how women as well as men become oppressors when they resort to a notion of biological superiority, and how trans people suffer from binarism, Her feminism in this story should be situated amongst the feminist debate of the 70s, when positive appreciations of femininity, female symbols, and women's bodies, as in Hélène Sixtus de la Femme Medusa, were trending. Carter questioned this trend through thought experiments in the novel, which made her, in my opinion, incredibly ahead of her time. Her vision is more relevant than ever in the 21st century, as we are still debating issues of biology, misogyny, misandry, and trans exclusion. Her playful and inclusive approach is inspirational in this divided society with opposing and divisive ideologies. Carter's powerful and playful interrogation and deconstruction of hegemony in gender as well as in national and racial identities are the basis of her strength and progressiveness as an author of global literature. What is especially remarkable is the fact that the target practices for deconstruction include her own. She criticized her own privilege as a British middle class and examined colonialist mindset in her own writing. For example, Carter writes that white women can't get out of our historic complicity in colonialism any more than the white working class can, quote and unquote. She also said, I quote, in some respects, perhaps, it's a rather arrogant thing for a white middle-class woman from a different country to say that she feels more affinity to third-world writers, because I cannot dissociate myself from the history of my country. I notice, and it makes me very angry, that a lot of American feminists are perfectly prepared to dissociate themselves from the history of America. They are perfectly prepared to say, yes, but women have always been more oppressed than ... As I have written in my articles, although the interrogation of hegemony is found in her work created before her Japan years, there is no doubt that her critical practice was taken to a much higher level while she was in Japan. The Japan years were an important catalyst for Carter to find herself in a myriad of intersections of gender, race, nationality, and class, and drove her to no longer be complacent in her position. Although Carter and Japan have such a strong connection, Carter has not gained sufficient popularity in Japan. There are layers of hindrances here. One is a language barrier. Carter's English is often very sophisticated and structurally difficult. Frequent intertextual references and ironic expressions do not help Asian English learners. Another major problem is Japanese translation, which is supposed to help Japanese students. The translators customarily use very old-fashioned gendered language in translating foreign texts to Japanese. Oftentimes, this brings about incongruency to the story's atmosphere and produces mistranslations and misunderstandings. Another more fundamental problem is the lack of feminism in Japanese society. Carter's progressiveness is often too advanced for readers who are still deeply embedded in a patriarchal society. After all, Japan ranks 120th in the Global Gender Gap Report in 2021. Yet, I'm feeling a gradual sea change happening amongst students in recent years. Internet technology and the global #MeToo movement stirred some interest in feminism among young women in Japan and brought about more political awareness. They witnessed how women abroad are fighting for their rights, and they have started to question their own status in Japanese society. They began to be aware of how sexual harassment is widespread in Japan, how victim shaming is still strong, how women are still unfairly treated in the workplace, and how housekeeper and caregiver duties are mainly thrust onto women. The number of students taking my course on feminism, for instance, has doubled in recent years. Feminism at last seems to be catching the attention of Japanese women. However, the number of students attempting to teach Western feminist theory is still very small. The English in theoretical articles is often too difficult, and oftentimes there are no translations available. Instead of reading theoretical writing and attaining their own feminism developed from various perspectives and opinions, students tend to turn easily to YouTube videos and popular SNS posts, which are shorter and easier, but often generalize, oversimplify, and make hasty conclusions. Many so-called feminist posts contain misandry, which I also find problematic. Asian and Japanese contexts are not considered most either. Instead, I found that using literary texts as a way of teaching feminism is more useful and meaningful. Literary texts can demonstrate feminist thought in a more nuanced, situated way without using big words. They can encourage the reader to put themselves in others' shoes, invite them to empathize the characters and to contemplate what can be done. For this purpose, Carter's oeuvre is superb, not because it is clear-cut and easy to understand, but because the other way around. In fact, her protagonists typically allow the reader to accompany them on their detoured journey to epiphany. Recently, I found that Carter's retellings of fairy tales are the perfect teaching material in this sense, partly because the original stories are familiar to Japanese students. You may think Japanese students are more familiar with Japanese folklore. Not true. They are actually more familiar with Western fairy tales. For Japanese students nowadays, Disney narratives are the folklore. They have been immersed in Disney fairy tale narratives since childhood. Disney fairy tales are riddled with problems, as you all know. Marriage with a blue-eyed, blonde-haired prince is set as the ultimate goal for heroines, and women's possibilities are often limited to domestic caring duties. Ideologies related to gender, class, and race are hidden in their pretty stories. What is especially damaging for Japanese students is that their Caucasian complex and self-doubt are potentially intensified through consuming these narratives. Disney is not the only cause of their sense of superiority, of course. Historically, since the era of modernization in Japan in the late 19th century, modernity and power have been symbolized by the West. Japanese people have been taught that they are lagging behind and they need to think, speak, and look like Western people in order to be accepted among the powerful developed nations. The ideal image of Japanese women drastically changed from the pre-modern to modern era. In pre-modern Japan, ideal womanhood involved a very narrow waist, a wave-like posture, and narrow eyes. However, in the modern era, especially after the influence of the American film industry, beautiful women in Japan are supposed to have big eyes, with long eyelashes, big boobs, and long, strong legs. Junichiro Tanizaki's novel, Naomi, for instance, is about a Japanese man grooming a young Japanese woman who looks like Mary Pickford to look and behave perfectly like a Western woman. The sense of inferiority only increased after World War II because the Japanese attempt at recapturing power failed and American ideals flooded into Japanese society even more. Many Japanese students today still internalize these views. Angela Carter was aware of this problem in Japanese people, perhaps because of her interaction with Sozo Araki, who was her boyfriend when she was in Japan from 1969 to 1972. The racial issue was big for Araki, and it was only one of the major reasons for their breakup, in my opinion, because Carter couldn't help but continuously remind him of his inferiority to certain people. Araki was quite similar to Joji Kawai, the narrator of Tanizaki's story, Naomi, who chose Naomi to be his girlfriend because she looked like a foreigner, but was not really, and therefore was not as threatening and intimidating as an actual Western woman. In an essay on Naomi, Carter writes as follows, I quote, "For Kawaii, Naomi stands for all the allure of the exotic, but she only stands for it. She does not embody it. She is in reality just as Japanese as he is. His own sense of self is never at risk with her, as it would be with a real foreigner." End of quote. Carter here addresses the different consequences of the Western complex in men and women in Japan. For Japanese men, it is about ego and pride, but for Japanese women, it is much more complicated. They need to look like a foreign woman, but not exactly like one, in order to appease Japanese men's bruised ego. It's not for themselves that the Japanese women need to care about, but the men and their feelings. The Western complex and the male dominance in Japanese society that allowed the grooming of a young woman by a Japanese man for his own benefit are very much connected in Carter's analysis, and rightly so. 50 years has passed since Araki and Carter were an item, but fundamentally, the Western complex in Japanese people hasn't changed much. Even though feminism is gaining a certain level of currency in Japanese society, Japanese young women are still trying to look like Western women to an extent. Dye their hair blonde or brown and wear blue or brown contact lenses. In girls' magazines in Japan, models of mixed race between white and Japanese are very popular, as they embody the right amount of the exotic. Disney fairy tales do not mitigate this complex either. Although recent adjustment to Disney films such as A Focused Siblings Love in Frog, slightly feminist heroine and storyline in Beauty and the Beast, and non-white characters in Pocahontas, Mulan, and Moana are certainly welcome and appreciated. But their internalized white supremacism and westernized beauty standards have hardly shifted. Disney versions of feminism and cultural diversity are simply not deconstructive enough. They also do not provide any learning opportunities for Japanese people to think about their own racism. As I said, racial matters have been far-reaching in Japan, but we have always been about Japan and the West. And yet, Japan has its own colonial past. and racism towards other Asian people is definitely present, though hidden from the national narrative. Carter's retellings of fairy tales, on the other hand, really help Japanese students in their journey to true deconstruction. The stories collected in the Bloody Chamber are not black and white stories, but shades of gray. Protagonists often find themselves trapped in a situation that is partly their own doing. Unlike the version, the ending is not a typical happy ending, where the patriarchal agenda is concealed, and the students are often surprised and perplexed by this. By comparing these stories with the original fairy tales, students can grasp their own misconceptions, racism, sexism, as well as social conditioning in their expectations of romantic happy ending. For instance, in the story The Bloody Chamber, the protagonist falls for the Marquis, tempted by his authority, rank, sex appeal, wealth, as well as her own narcissism. When she finds out about his true nature, it seems too late for her to escape, and she nearly accepts her bloody fate. She's not an innocent girl, typical of a fairy tale, but an ordinary girl with her own desires and shortcomings. Her attempt to flee from this violent husband with the help of her mother is all the more inspirational because she's an ordinary woman with whom the reader can identify. She's rescued by her mother, which is also a welcome change from the original. But the important lesson in this story is that the protagonist really tries to save herself. She does not come to her husband's logic that she herself is to blame. The happy ending with a blind piano tuner is the outcome of her self-reflection, and it's not a typical fairy tale ending where wealth is promised. The protagonist becomes stronger, no longer enticed by wealth, power, or rank. It is a very positive remake of Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, in which the heroine is quite powerless. Carter's story may in fact be closer to stories in the oral tradition, where the heroine tries to save herself and her sisters aided by another human or animal. For Japanese students, this story gives them an important perspective on domestic abuse, where the abuser typically makes the abused feel that they invite their own downfall because they are not pure or innocent. Carter's story instead gives the reader the power to resist such logic and fight for their survival and freedom. The protagonist is not innocent, and she has her share of shortcomings, but she learns from her mistakes, and so do the readers. Students' expectations for fairy tales are pleasantly overturned by this story, which gives them the opportunity to elect their dreams of a happy marriage. My favorite text for teaching her is Tiger's Pride. The original story, Beauty and the Beast, is very popular among Japanese students, partly because of the Disney film. It's a romantic love story between a slightly intelligent woman and a powerful beast who is later reformed, turning out to be a handsome and rich prince, appeals to students polluted by romantic ideology and popular half-baked feminism. Although it contains so much conservative ideology, students are persuaded by the feel-good storyline and happy ending. But Carter's retelling stuns readers. The beast's strange quest, the tears shed by the beast, and the final transformation of the heroine into a beast herself are all perplexing at first. But they, in the end, give the readers great opportunities to reflect on their own stereotyping tendencies. The protagonist from the beginning treats the beast as a sexual predator and refuses his request to show his naked body. The readers are with the protagonist, thinking his request to be an objectifying, erotic, and degrading one. However, the learns that she has been mistaken. Unlike the beast in the original version by Madame Villeneuve and by Madame Beaumont, this beast in Carter's tale is not a man in disguise. The beast is a real beast, a wild animal. The beast's request is not an erotic one, but a request from an animal to a human being to be equal by showing each other their true skin. The protagonist who has been in the wrong and has to be reformed, not the beast, unlike in Disney version. Another useful perspective is that this story might be about mistranslation and communication failure. The beast does not speak to the protagonist directly, for his native language is not human and is always translated through his valet. The protagonist's native language is not Italian, the language that the valet use. So they are both handicapped in their communication. Furthermore, the conversation is being related by the in English. So there are layers of translations involved in here. Let's take a look at the scene where the valet conveys the master's request to the protagonist. The valet coughed. To him fell the delicate task of transmitting to me his master's wishes. My master, a stick fell in the grate. It made a mighty clatter in that dreadful silence. The valet stared, lost his place in his speech, began again. My master has but one desire. He wishes only. Now, in the face of my impassivity, the valet twittered, his ironic composure gone. For the desire of a master, however trivial, may yet sound unbearably insolent in the mouth of a servant, and his role of go-between clearly caused him a good deal of embarrassment. He gulped, he swallowed, at last contrived to unleash an unpunctuated flood. My master's sole desire is to see the pretty young lady unclothed, nude, without her dress, and that only for the one time after which she was returned to her father damaged with banker orders for the sum which she lost my master at cards, and also a number of fine presents such as furs, jewels, and horses. I remained standing. During this interview, my eyes were level with those inside the mask that now evaded mine, as if to his credit. He was ashamed of his request, even as his mouthpiece made it for him. Agitato, molto agitato, the valet wrung his white-gloved hand. Desnuda. Sorry, I got to change the slide. Desnuda originally just with clothes. However, the protagonist as well as the readers interpret the word in association with the English word nude, which is loaded with erotic, objectifying connotation in the history of Western culture. Master's request, translated to human language by the valet, inevitably take on these connotations and is understood by the protagonist as a degrading, transactional request of a female body, a type of sex work. Based on this interpretation, the protagonist responded sharply with a request back for a windowless room in which she shows her lower body while covering her face. The beast's true intention does not reach the protagonist because she is enraged, thinking she has been treated as a sex toy, and infuriated at the social system where women's bodies are abused every day. Her misandry, her distrust of human males, her previous experience of being objectified, her preconceived notion of beastliness, all have made the protagonist blind to the beast's true intention and to the possibility that she misunderstands him. However, in that context, the beast's subsequent tears are unintelligible, the first indication that something is wrong with her interpretation. She finally realizes her misunderstanding at the riverbank, where the beast unrobes and shows her his wild animal nakedness, shaking, scared. She has been blind to his vulnerability, his fear, as an animal in the presence of a human being. But now, finally, she realizes her privilege, her power, and her prejudice towards the beast. The perspective shift here is a drastic one, and it usually takes a while for the students to realize what has happened and to adjust their view accordingly. When they are successful, the learning is profound. The protagonist and the readers have been trapped in a divided world of black and white. The beast is either a sexual predator with abusive, exploitative power or a romantic partner in heterosexual relationship. Their stereotypes are deeply ingrained and do not easily allow them to see the beast as anything other than these two. The communication difficulty only aggravates their prejudice. But when they realize that they have been completely off the mark, they start to look at the world differently. They realize they might have made a mistake in interpreting the request of the beast. They might have made a wrong judgment about him. They see how they have a tendency to misunderstand racial, sexual, and linguistic others according to their stereotypes, and a tendency to be scornful of those with speech deficiencies or limited language abilities. They see how they have been complicit in the abuse and exploitation of the beast, who does not speak human language. They also see how human narratives have anthropomorphized animals and used them as metaphors for sexual predators. The anthropocentric perspectives collapse to make way for alternative, post-human, or anti-human perspectives. The collapse of the castle in the final scene encapsulates this complete paradigm shift. The sweet thunder of this purr shook the old walls, made the shutters batter the windows, until they burst apart and let in the white light of the snowy moon. Tiles came crashing down from the roof. I heard them fall into the courtyard far below. The reverberation of his purring rocked the foundation of the house. The walls began to dance. I thought, it will all fall. Everything will disintegrate. End of quote. This scene is truly magnificent in its power of deconstruction. Every human construct crumbles down, and two animals with beautiful pelts are all that remain. This story lays bare how we live in a myriad of intersections. A less privileged person is privileged from another perspective, and power relations are more complicated than is often explained. This story particularly strongly resonates with Japanese students because of their language situation in the world, where they need to rely on translations all the time.
Sorry, Natsumi.
Yeah.
It's 10 o'clock, so it's time for the next panel. So could I ask you to wrap it up? Sorry about that.
Yeah. I will wrap up.
Thank you.
So translation is not perfect. They may be mistranslated. So you have to always dig deeper. So the final paragraph. The story is also a very important feminist lesson with regard to the politics of gaze. The protagonist thinks she has been objectified victim, but during the intersection with the beast, she has also been a manipulator of the gaze. So it's truly rewarding, though challenging, to teach Carter to Japanese students with careful guidance, helped by additional reading materials on feminism, Orientalism, and racism. Carter's stories help Japanese students deconstruct their own internalized Orientalism and gender stereotype. Carter's literature has a great potential beyond classroom and can bring about empowerment and liberation to today's Japanese students. Personally, as to borrow Carter's words, I became radicalized by reading Angela Carter. It was revelating, empowering, and life-changing experience for me. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. So for us, Angela Carter is not just one of her favorite authors, but a guiding light for survival, a visionary for better society, a great teacher in feminism from a global, anti-colonial, deconstructive perspective. I hope Carter's visionary power will empower more and more people in the world in their endeavor to make this world a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natsumi. Because I'm just going to stop recording.